Love is not just for this world. If you want to discover feelings that transcend boundaries, subscribe now. The figure lay sprawled on the roadside, a motionless silhouette against the night, barely distinguishable in the weak glow of James's headlights. At first, he thought it was a man, perhaps a drifter, someone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But as he leaned forward, his stomach tightened. The skin, if it could even be called that, had a strange silver hue, the way oil slicks shimmered under sunlight, shifting in color every time his eyes tried to pin it down. Deep gashes marred its body, dark liquid oozing sluggishly from the wounds, too thick to be blood, too alien to be anything he could name. It glistened in the cold air, pooling on the cracked pavement. The creature's chest rose and fell, barely perceptible, each breath a struggle. Whatever it was alive, but not for long. James tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Every rational thought told him to leave. Drive. Go home. Lock the door and pretend he had seen nothing. The world had rules, and this thing was not part of them. He had heard too many stories, watched enough news to know that things that fell from the sky rarely brought good fortune. And yet, despite the warning bells clanging in his head, something about the being gnawed at him. Not fear, not even curiosity, but something deeper. A recognition of desperation. He had seen that look before, in places he tried not to think about. A breath left him slow, resigned. God damn it. He shut off the engine and stepped out. The night air pressed against his skin, thick with moisture and the sharp tang of metal, as if lightning had struck moments before. Gravel crunched under his boots as he approached, every step hesitant, deliberate. Closer now, he could see that the wounds weren't random, not the result of a fall or an accident. These were deliberate, slices, punctures, the telltale marks of a battle. Something had done this, something with precision. James crouched beside the figure. The face, though humanoid, was sharp in ways that human faces weren't. High, angular cheekbones, a strong jaw, but slightly elongated, almost too symmetrical. The skin, despite its wounds, looked resilient, like polished metal given life. And the eyes, closed now, were framed by long, dark lashes, their shape more feline than human. Its fingers twitched, startling him. Can you hear me? James's voice came out steadier than he felt. No answer. The creature remained still, its breath rattling in its chest. Whatever this was, whoever this was, it wouldn't survive the night without help. He exhaled sharply. This was reckless. Stupid. But James had never been able to turn his back on something that needed saving. And if he left now, it would die. Sliding his arms beneath its body, he lifted. The weight surprised him. It was denser than it looked, its muscles coiled and heavy beneath its smooth skin. It felt solid, powerful. Even in its weakness, there was an undeniable strength to it, like a sleeping predator. The moment he hoisted it up, its fingers curled slightly, brushing against his arm. A reflex? A plea? He didn't know. The truck's back seat was small, but he managed to lay the creature across it. It didn't stir, save for the slow rise and fall of its chest. James shut the door, climbed into the driver's seat, and pulled back onto the road. The silence was thick, broken only by the hum of the tires on asphalt. His eyes flicked to the rear-view mirror more times than he cared to admit. Every time, he half expected the thing to sit up, to speak, to open its eyes and look at him with something unreadable. But it remained still. What the hell am I doing? He muttered. Taking in strays was one thing. He had nursed his fair share of injured animals back to health. Abandoned dogs, wounded birds, once even a half-dead coyote that had collapsed near his porch. But this was different. This wasn't some lost creature of the woods. This was something else. Something not of this world. By the time he reached the cabin, doubt had settled deep in his bones. The drive had done nothing to ease the growing weight in his chest. Yet, despite the warnings screaming in his mind, he stepped out, opened the back door, and carried the being inside. His home was small, nestled deep in the woods, where civilization felt like a distant memory. A single-story structure, with wooden beams and a stone fireplace that crackled in the winter. It had always been a place of solitude, of retreat. But tonight, it held something wholly unnatural. He laid the creature on the couch, the leather cool beneath its skin. It still hadn't moved, save for the slow, uneven breaths that ghosted past its lips. James lingered a moment, unsure. Then, shaking off his hesitation, he turned to gather supplies. Warm water, clean cloth, the first aid kit that had seen more use than he liked to admit. He worked in silence, dabbing away the dark, viscous liquid that seeped from its wounds. The substance clung to the cloth in thick strands, refusing to soak in the way blood would. It smelled faintly of something metallic, something almost electric. He had no idea if disinfectant would help or harm. So he opted for water, wiping away the worst of the grime. The wounds beneath were deep, but not as raw as he expected, already knitting together, as if the being's body was repairing itself. And then it moved. A sharp inhale, ragged, jarring, like someone who had been drowning breaking the surface of the water. James froze. The creature's eyelids fluttered. And then, for the first time, it opened its eyes. They were not human. A brilliant, shifting color, gold, silver, hints of blue in the firelight. The pupils contracted unnaturally, adjusting to the dim room. 1,000 thoughts hit James at once. Questions, realizations, warnings. But before he could speak, before he could even move, the creature exhaled one word. A single word, barely more than a whisper, but filled with weight, with meaning, with something ancient and knowing. Survived. James's stomach clenched. He had no idea what he had just brought into his home. James exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him like an iron chain. The alien stood before him, posture rigid but composed, eyes flickering like liquid gold in the dim light of the fireplace. The earlier frailty, the desperate vulnerability of the thing he had carried into his home, had been an illusion, or, at the very least, temporary. Now, standing at full height, the being radiated something else entirely. Power, precision, a quiet, restrained lethality. James wasn't sure if he should be grateful or terrified. The fire popped, sending a brief shower of sparks up the stone hearth. James let out a slow breath and leaned against the wall, arms crossing over his chest. The rifle was within reach, but he resisted the instinct to grab it. If this thing meant him harm, he had a feeling a gun wouldn't make much of a difference. "You healed fast," he muttered, watching the alien with careful scrutiny. "I was built to," it replied. That word again, built. Not born, not grown, but designed. The distinction sent an uncomfortable prickle down James's spine. He had suspected the being wasn't just some lost traveler, but the way it spoke, the calculated control in its voice, confirmed what his gut had already warned him. This was not a being accustomed to weakness. James kept his expression neutral, but the weight of the alien's gaze told him it wasn't fooled. He was being evaluated, measured, the same way a predator sizes up another in unfamiliar territory. Finally, James broke the silence. "You gonna tell me who tried to kill you, or am I just supposed to guess?" The alien's gaze didn't waver. For a moment, James thought it wouldn't answer. Then, finally it spoke. "They will come again." James sighed. "Yeah, you mentioned that. Who are they?" The creature was silent for a beat longer than necessary, as if weighing the cost of speaking further. Then, "My kind does not fall easily. I was not meant to be left behind. The ones who did this," its voice dipped, not with fear, but something close to disdain. "They believed they had succeeded." Something about the way it said the word believed sent a chill curling through James's chest. "So they think you're dead," he said slowly. A small nod. James rubbed his jaw. "Right. And when they find out you're not." The alien's expression remained impassive, but there was something in its stance, an almost imperceptible shift, a tightening of its shoulders. James had seen that look before, in men who had been to war, men who knew what awaited them when the fight finally came knocking. "They will try again." James let that sit for a moment. It wasn't a threat, not really, just a fact. Cold, unavoidable. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Great. That's just fantastic." The alien tilted its head slightly, almost like it was studying his reaction. You do not fear me, it observed. James let out a dry, humorless laugh. Oh, I do, he admitted. I just don't see the point in panicking about it. The creature regarded him for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind those shifting gold eyes. Then, to James's surprise, it inclined its head in what almost seemed like acknowledgement. You saved my life, it said. James arched a brow. Yeah, we've established that. The alien straightened, its posture eerily formal. A debt must be repaid. James frowned. Look, I wasn't. In my culture, the alien continued, voice steady, a life debt is not lightly given, or lightly ignored. James hesitated. You're serious? A single, unblinking nod. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. All right, hold on. Let's just slow down a second. I pulled you out of the dirt, yeah, but that doesn't mean you owe me anything. You don't have to. I do. The alien interrupted. There was no hesitation in its tone, no room for argument. James narrowed his eyes. And what does that mean exactly? The alien didn't answer immediately. Instead, it stepped forward just enough that the firelight cast long shadows over the hard planes of its face. It means, it said, voice quiet but unyielding, that from this moment forward, no harm will come to you while I still breathe. James stared. His first instinct was to argue, to tell the thing it was being ridiculous, that it didn't need to swear some kind of warrior's oath over what had essentially been a bad judgment call on his part. But something in the way it spoke and the absolute certainty in its tone made him pause. This wasn't gratitude. This wasn't obligation. This was something deeper, something etched into its very being. James ran a hand down his face. Jesus. The alien didn't respond. It simply stood there, waiting, unwavering. James exhaled sharply. So what? You're my bodyguard now, if that is what you wish to call it. James let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Fantastic. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the quiet crackling of the fire. Finally, James shook his head. I'm going to bed. The alien inclined its head slightly, as if granting him permission in his own damn house. James rolled his eyes and turned toward the hallway, muttering under his breath. As he reached the doorway, he paused, glancing over his shoulder. You got a name? The alien hesitated. Then, XYZ. James blinked. Right. That's a mouthful. He turned away again, stepping into the shadows of the hall. Behind him, the fire burned low, the night stretching long and uncertain ahead of them both. James stood at the cabin window, staring out into the forest but seeing nothing. Not in the way that meant nothing was there. No, it was something worse. His gut told him the trees weren't empty, that something still lingered in the spaces between, watching, waiting. He had seen predators before. Wolves tracking a wounded deer. Coyotes circling a dying elk. He knew that kind of patience. The way hunger shaped movement. The way anticipation sharpened stillness. But whatever had been out there tonight, it wasn't hungry. It wasn't even stalking. It had been studying. James exhaled through his nose and ran a hand down his face. He turned, glancing at XYZ. The alien hadn't moved since they returned, standing near the door, his posture as unreadable as ever. But James saw the tension in him now, the way his fingers flexed slightly, the way his gaze never left the window. He wasn't just being cautious. He was waiting for something to happen. James broke the silence. You want to tell me what that was? XYZ's gold-silver eyes flicked toward him. Something that should not be here. James huffed out a dry laugh. Yeah, I got that part. He picked up his rifle, checking the chamber like muscle memory alone could settle his nerves. You saying the thing isn't just some intergalactic stray? XYZ didn't answer immediately. He moved toward the window, slow, deliberate. It was aware of us. It chose to let us leave. James frowned. Right. So why? XYZ's jaw tightened. I do not know. James leaned against the table, crossing his arms. Did it recognize you? There was a pause. Subtle. Almost imperceptible. But it was there. I do not think so, XYZ said carefully. James narrowed his eyes. But you're not sure. XYZ remained silent. That was answer enough. James shook his head. All right, well, I don't know about you, but I don't love the idea of some invisible nightmare hanging out in my woods. He gestured vaguely toward the outside. What do we deal with it? XY turned fully to face him. We do not. James blinked. What? XY's voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, an edge James hadn't heard before. It did not attack. It let us leave. That is a warning. James scoffed. You think it's just going to leave us alone? That's wishful thinking. XYZ stepped closer, his tone firm. If we provoke it, we will not survive. James stared at him. XYZ had fought his way out of near death, healed injuries that should have killed him in a matter of hours. If he was saying they couldn't win, that meant whatever was out there wasn't just dangerous. It was something far worse. James sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Fantastic. Silence stretched between them. The fire had burned low, throwing flickering shadows along the wooden walls. Finally, James dropped into a chair, the weight of the night settling into his bones. All right, let's say I listen to you. Let's say we leave it alone. What happens next? XYZ's gaze remained steady. It depends. On. If it was sent, XYZ said, or if it came on its own. James felt his stomach tighten. He didn't like either of those options. You think something sent it? XYZ's expression was unreadable. There are things in this universe that do not wander without purpose. James exhaled slowly. And what if it wasn't sent? What if it's just some thing floating around space until it stumbled on us? XYZ's gaze darkened. Then it will return. James didn't ask how he knew. He didn't need to. A deep, exhausted silence filled the cabin. The weight of what had happened pressed down on James's chest, heavy and suffocating. He wasn't built for this. He could handle a rifle, could track a buck through the woods for miles, could survive on his own better than most. But things that moved without sound, things that bent reality just by existing, this was out of his league. But apparently, it wasn't out of XYZ's. James leaned back in his chair, studying the alien for a long moment. All right, he said finally. Say this thing comes back. Say it's not alone next time. What exactly am I supposed to do? XYZ's eyes met his. You will stay alive. James snorted. Hell of a plan. XYZ's expression remained unchanged. You saved my life, James. That means yours is now my responsibility. James ran a hand through his hair. You keep saying that, like it's some law carved into stone somewhere. In my culture, XYZ said, voice steady, it is. James exhaled. Right. He scrubbed a hand down his face. You got some kind of warrior code I need to be worried about? XYZ regarded him for a long moment before answering. I was created to be a weapon, but I did not serve those who made me. James straightened slightly. That was the first time XYZ had offered anything personal about himself. James considered that, then tilted his head. That why they try to kill you? XYZ's gaze flickered, but he didn't answer. James sighed. Okay, so you've got people after you. I've got a reality-breaking nightmare lurking in my backyard. And we're just supposed to hope neither of those things become a problem. XYZ's expression didn't change. Hope is irrelevant. We prepare. James huffed a dry laugh. Now that sounds like a plan I can get behind. XYZ nodded once, as if something had just been decided. James pushed himself up from the chair, stretching the tension from his back. All right, sun's up, and I need coffee before I deal with any more existential threats. XYZ tilted his head slightly. You will rest first. James arched a brow. Excuse me? You did not sleep. James rolled his eyes. Yeah, well, kind of hard to get a good night's rest when things are phasing in and out of existence 100 yards from your front door. XYZ remained unmoved. You will be no use to yourself, or to me, if you collapse from exhaustion. James crossed his arms. You're not my mother. No, XYZ said simply. But I am your protector. James blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no idea what to say to that. After a long moment, he sighed. Fine, but only because I'm too tired to argue. XYZ gave a small, approving nod. James shook his head and turned toward the hallway. If I wake up and you're watching me sleep again, I'm going to shoot you. XYZ didn't respond. James wasn't sure if that meant he was joking, or if XYZ just didn't think the bullets would matter. He decided not to ask. James woke to the smell of coffee. It wasn't the first thing he expected. The scent drifted through the cabin, rich and warm, settling in the space between sleep and waking like an anchor. For a moment, just a moment, it almost felt normal. Almost. Then reality settled in. He pushed himself upright, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, body still heavy with exhaustion. The morning light streamed in through the wooden blinds, casting long streaks of gold across the floor. The rifle rested against the nightstand, right where he had left it. Nothing had disturbed his sleep. No whispers in the dark. No movement at the edge of the woods. Just silence. James sighed and swung his legs over the side of the bed. His boots sat where he had kicked them off the night before, laces loose. He pulled them on, mind still sluggish, and made his way to the main room. XYZ stood by the stove, moving with the same measured precision he did in everything else. He wasn't wearing his armor, just the simple black fabric that had been beneath it, torn in places from his earlier injuries. Despite his size, he moved quietly, in perfect control of his body. It was unsettling in a way James hadn't quite figured out yet. "You drink coffee?" James asked, voice rough with sleep. XYZ glanced at him, then back at the stove. "No." James ran a hand through his hair. "Then why?" "You do." James blinked. He didn't know what was stranger, the fact that the alien had made him coffee, or the fact that he had apparently been paying enough attention to know he drank it in the first place. "Well," James muttered, crossing the room. "That's new." XYZ said nothing, simply poured a cup and set it down on the table. James sat, fingers curling around the warm ceramic. He took a sip. Perfect. He frowned at the mug. "How the hell did you know how to make it like this?" XYZ tilted his head slightly. "I observed." James narrowed his eyes. "You watched me make coffee." "I watched you." James paused. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. He took another sip, letting the silence settle between them. XYZ didn't sit, just stood near the window, gaze flicking toward the tree line every so often. James followed his line of sight, but the woods remained still. "You expecting something?" James asked. XYZ didn't answer right away. "Then, there is always something to expect." James exhaled through his nose. "You always talk like that." XYZ glanced at him. "Like what?" James gestured vaguely. "Like a cryptic war manual." There was a pause. Then, to James's absolute surprise, XYZ said, "Yes." James huffed a quiet laugh. "Well, at least you're self-aware." XYZ studied him for a moment, then returned his attention to the forest. His expression didn't change, but there was something different about the way he stood. Attention. Not fear, not exactly, but something close. James set his mug down. "You're waiting for it to come back." XYZ nodded. "It will." James leaned back in his chair. "Great. And when it does?" XYZ's golden eyes flickered in the morning light. "We survive." James sighed. "That's starting to sound like your version of good morning." XYZ didn't argue. The silence stretched. Outside, the wind picked up, shifting through the trees, stirring the leaves just enough to remind James that the world was still moving, that things still existed beyond the weight of whatever had happened last night. But it didn't change the fact that something had happened, and that it wasn't over. James rubbed a hand over his face. "I need to check the perimeter." "I already did." James looked up. "Of course you did." He sighed and stood. "All right, then I guess I should do something normal, like drive into town for supplies." XYZ turned toward him fully. "I will accompany you." James snorted. "Yeah, I don't think you're going to blend in at the gas station, pal." XYZ didn't seem amused. "If something is watching, it will wait until you are alone." James hesitated. He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell XYZ that he'd been coming and going from this cabin for years without a damn babysitter. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Not anymore. Because now, something else knew he was here. James sighed. "Fine, but you're staying in the truck." XYZ inclined his head. "Acceptable." James finished his coffee in silence, pretending not to notice the way XYZ watched the trees, pretending he didn't feel the same thing crawling under his skin. They left an hour later. The drive into town was quiet. The old truck rattled over the dirt road, kicking up dust in its wake. the early morning sun casting long shadows across the empty stretch of highway. James kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly near the rifle in the passenger seat. Not paranoia, just habit. XYZR sat still, gaze locked on the passing trees, shoulders squared like a soldier waiting for orders. James glanced at him. You ever been to Earth before? No. Uh-huh. James tapped his fingers against the wheel. Well, let me give you the grand tour. Trees, trees, more trees. And if we're real lucky, a gas station that still sells beef jerky that won't break your teeth. XYZR didn't react. James sighed. You're a real joy to talk to, you know that? I was not created for conversation. Yeah, no kidding. The drive continued, the town coming into view in the distance. It wasn't much, just a handful of buildings, a general store, a diner that served coffee strong enough to melt metal. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, which meant James couldn't exactly stroll in with an 8-foot-tall alien without raising some questions. He pulled into the lot outside the store and put the truck in park. All right, stay here. I'll be back in 5. XYZR's gaze flicked toward the street. Be aware. James snorted. Yeah. If the beef jerky looks like it could double as a weapon, I'll steer clear. XYZR didn't smile. James shook his head and stepped out, making his way inside. The store was the same as always. Dim lighting, shelves stacked with everything from canned goods to fishing bait. A radio playing some old country song that barely reached the speakers. James grabbed what he needed, exchanging nods with the clerk, keeping the conversation short. The fewer questions, the better. By the time he stepped back outside, the air had changed. Not much. Not enough for the average person to notice. But James wasn't the average person. And after last night, he wasn't willing to ignore the way his skin prickled. He glanced toward the truck. XYZR was already looking at him. James's grip tightened on the bag in his hands. He started walking. Not fast, not slow, just normal. The feeling didn't leave. He reached the truck, opened the door, tossed the bag inside. Then, quietly, without turning his head, he asked, Are we being watched? XYZR didn't move, didn't blink. Yes. James inhaled through his nose, exhaled slow. Then he put the truck in gear and drove. James kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the rifle beside him, fingers light but ready. The road stretched ahead, winding through the pines, the sky above a dull gray that threatened rain but hadn't yet delivered. The town had faded behind them, leaving nothing but open road and the weight of XYZR's words hanging thick in the air. Yes, they were being watched. James exhaled slowly through his nose. He had been in enough dangerous situations to know that acknowledging something was hunting you didn't change the fact. It just made it harder to ignore. How close? He asked, not taking his eyes off the road. XYZR remained still in the passenger seat, his gold and silver gaze unreadable. Far enough to stay hidden, close enough to act, if necessary. James's jaw tightened. He wasn't sure which part of that sentence he hated more. He scanned the tree line, searching for movement, but saw nothing. That didn't mean much. You think it's the thing from last night? XYZR's fingers flexed slightly against his knee. A habit, maybe. A subconscious reaction. It was the closest thing to unease James had seen from him. No, XYZR said finally. This is something else. James gritted his teeth. That was worse. The truck rattled over a pothole, shaking them both. James adjusted his grip, casting another glance toward the trees. You want to elaborate? It is not here to kill. XYZR's gaze didn't waver. Not yet. James let out a dry laugh. Wow, real comforting. XYZR didn't respond. They drove in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady hum of the engine and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. James forced himself to think. If something was watching, and it wasn't the same thing from last night, that meant there were at least 2 different entities in play. And he had no idea which one was worse. The town had been quiet. No odd looks from the locals. No signs that anyone else had noticed anything strange. If whatever was watching them was there, it had been careful, which meant it was patient. James hated patient things. They always had a plan. We taking this thing back to my cabin? He asked finally. XYZR considered that. Then, after a pause, he shook his head. No, that would be unwise. James frowned. Why? XYZar turned his head slightly, finally looking at him. Because it would follow. James cursed under his breath. If it was willing to follow them but not attack, then it wanted something. Maybe information. Maybe confirmation. Maybe it was waiting for the right moment. James glanced at XYZar. I assume your brilliant plan isn't to just keep driving until it gets bored. No. James sighed. Of course not. XYZar's gaze flicked back toward the window. His posture was still composed, but there was an edge to it now, the kind of sharpness that came when someone was bracing for something inevitable. It will make itself known soon, he said. James huffed. Fantastic. The truck rumbled over a wooden bridge, the boards creaking beneath the weight of the tires. James knew this stretch of road well. Another mile, and there'd be a turnoff, an old logging trail that led deeper into the woods. He made a decision. Without warning, he yanked the wheel and veered off the main road. The truck bumped over the uneven dirt path, tires kicking up dust and pine needles. XYZar didn't react, just braced a hand against the dashboard, his expression unreadable. James drove another 100 yards before pulling to a stop. He killed the engine. The forest swallowed them in an instant, the absence of sound pressing against his ears. XYZar turned to him. You intend to confront it. James unbuckled his seatbelt. I intend to stop playing this game. XYZar studied him. Then, after a moment, he nodded. They stepped out. The truck settled as the weight shifted, the doors shutting with quiet finality. James adjusted his grip on the rifle, rolling his shoulders. Nothing moved. The woods felt different now, thicker, heavier, like the air itself had changed. He had grown up in these forests, knew them better than he knew most people, but right now, they felt foreign. XYZar stepped ahead of him, scanning the trees with something far beyond human sight. Then, quietly, he said, It knows. James tightened his grip. Knows what? That we are waiting. James exhaled slowly. Good. They waited. The silence stretched, unnatural and suffocating. No birds. No wind. Just stillness. Then, finally it came. Not in the way James had expected. Not with a sudden charge, not with a sound, but with a presence, something pressing against the edges of his mind, like fingers trailing through thoughts that weren't its own. James clenched his jaw. Oh, that's new. XYZar tensed. His stance shifted, no longer still, no longer waiting. Ready. Then a voice. Not aloud, not spoken. You're not meant to be here. James's breath hitched. The words weren't in English, not in any language he recognized, but he understood them all the same. They weren't heard. They were given. His pulse hammered against his ribs. Yeah, well, neither are you. XYZar took a step forward. It is testing us. James swallowed. Testing us for what? The voice came again, curling around the inside of his skull like smoke. To see if he will break. Something shifted in the trees. Not movement, something deeper than that, as if the space itself was wrong. James felt it. A pressure, a weight, like something was pulling at him, unraveling him thread by thread. Then just as suddenly as it had come, it stopped. The air thinned. The world settled, and the presence was gone. James sucked in a sharp breath, stumbling slightly. He gritted his teeth, willing the dizziness away. XYZar remained still, but his hands were clenched into fists, his body wound tight. James steadied himself. What the hell was that? XYZar exhaled through his nose. A warning. James wiped a hand down his face. Yeah, I got that part. He looked at XYZar. You want to tell me why it felt like my brain was being pulled apart? XYZar hesitated. Then, finally, he said because it was. James stared at him. That's not how warnings usually work. XYZar's gaze was unreadable. No. James exhaled sharply. All right. Well, congratulations. You were right. It made itself known. He gestured toward the now empty woods. So what now? XYZar's golden eyes burned in the fading light. Now, he said, we prepare for when it returns. James gripped the rifle tighter, his heartbeat steady but his breath shallow. The woods had returned to an eerie stillness, the unnatural presence retreating, but its absence felt just as oppressive as its arrival. He wasn't sure if that was better or worse. Across from him, XYZR remained still, though there was something different in his posture, an almost imperceptible shift in the way he carried himself. Not relief, not tension, something in between, like a soldier waiting for an order that hadn't come yet. James exhaled slowly. That wasn't just a warning, he said, voice low. It wanted to see what we do. XYZR inclined his head. Yes. James turned, scanning the trees again, as if he'd catch sight of whatever had pressed itself into his mind moments ago. He didn't. Of course he didn't. He ran a hand down his face. So what the hell was it? Some kind of psychic scout? XYZR's golden gaze flickered. Not a scout. A judge. James narrowed his eyes. Judge of what? XYZR studied him for a moment before answering. Strength. Resolve. Fear. James let out a slow breath. Great. So did we pass? XYZR's expression didn't change. We were not eliminated. James huffed a dry laugh. Fantastic. Really setting the bar high. The weight of the encounter still pressed against his skull, the memory of that voice curling in the back of his mind. It had felt like something reaching into him, trying to pull him apart, understand him in a way that no living thing should be able to. And that was what unsettled him the most. It hadn't just spoken to him. It had felt him, and it had chosen to leave. James adjusted his grip on the rifle, trying to shake the unease from his bones. So, you're telling me that thing is going to be back at some point, and we're just supposed to what? Hope we don't fail the next test. XYZR didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, he said, it was not testing you. James stilled. The cold spread deeper this time. Slower. More suffocating. You're saying it was testing you. XYZR's jaw tightened just enough to confirm it. James swore under his breath, pacing a few steps away before turning back. Okay, great. Just great. So it wasn't here for me at all, was it? XYZR's silence was all the answer he needed. James let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. You know, I was really starting to think I was at the center of some kind of cosmic bad luck streak. But no, turns out I just let you into my house. He gestured vaguely toward him. And whatever the hell's out there wants something from you. XYZR held his gaze, unflinching. I told you from the beginning. My presence would bring danger. James exhaled sharply. Yeah, well, you left out the part where danger meant reality-warping nightmares that judge people for sport. XYZR didn't argue. He just watched, waiting. James rubbed a hand over his face, trying to smother the frustration curling beneath his skin. Fine, whatever. You got some insight here, then? Since apparently this thing knows who you are. XYZR's gaze darkened. It does not know me, but it recognizes what I am. James frowned. And what are you? A pause. Not hesitation, calculation. Then, a weapon. James exhaled slowly. Yeah, you keep saying that. I was created for war, XYZR said, voice even. But war does not end with battle. It lingers. It waits. Sometimes it follows. James absorbed that. So this thing, it's part of something bigger? Yes. And you're sure it's not here to kill us? If it wanted that, we would already be dead. James clenched his jaw. That was the problem, wasn't it? Something had the power to end them in seconds, and had chosen not to. That meant it had an agenda. And James didn't trust things with agendas. He glanced at XYZR again. The alien looked calm, but James was starting to realize that didn't mean anything. There was always something under the surface with him, something controlled, measured, something restrained. James adjusted his rifle, exhaling sharply. All right, so if we're not dead yet, what's our next move? XYZR didn't hesitate. We leave. James blinked. Come again. We cannot stay here, XYZR said. It knows this place. If it returns, it will not need to search. James processed that. You're saying we just pack up and go? Yes. James let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Not happening. XYZR narrowed his eyes slightly. Staying is not an option. It is for me, James shot back. I'm not running from something I don't understand. This is my land. I've lived here for years. If something wants me gone, it's going to have to do better than a cryptic mind game. XYZR studied him, the tension between them sharp. You misunderstand. This is not about territory. This is about survival. James crossed his arms. Yeah? Well, I survived just fine before you showed up. XYZar held his gaze, then said, "And if I leave?" James hesitated. The thought made his stomach twist, and he hated that. XYZar watched him closely. "Would you still survive?" James didn't answer right away. He wanted to say yes, wanted to be stubborn, but the truth was heavier than his pride. No, he wouldn't. Not because he wasn't capable, but because this thing, whatever it was, wasn't playing by rules he understood. And without XYZar, he'd be standing in the dark with an empty gun and no way to fight something that didn't bleed. James clenched his jaw. "You leaving?" XYZar tilted his head slightly. "No." James sighed, rubbing a hand through his hair. "Then I guess we're both stuck here." XYZar was silent for a moment. Then, to James's surprise, he said, "You saved my life. I will not force you to leave. But if you stay, you must be ready." James huffed a quiet laugh. "Pretty sure I was ready the moment I dragged your half-dead ass out of the woods." XYZar's expression shifted, just slightly. Amusement? Maybe. James sighed. "Fine. If we're doing this, we do it my way." He looked at XYZar. "You're going to tell me everything you know about this thing. No vague warrior wisdom. No riddles. Straight facts." XYZar inclined his head. "Understood." James nodded. "And in return, I'll show you how to properly drink a cup of coffee." XYZar blinked. "I do not." James cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Nope, that wasn't a request." XYZar tilted his head slightly, considering. Then, after a pause, he said, "Acceptable." James let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The woods were still quiet. The air was still heavy, but the weight pressing down on him didn't seem quite as crushing anymore. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time since this whole mess started, he wasn't standing alone.